From the courtroom to the newsroom, our first guest never stops fighting for what she believes in.
Here to discuss her latest book, Suspicion Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it, is author, lawyer, TV reporter, and activist Lisa Bloom. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
How many jobs do you have, Lisa?
Today, about three.
Well, let's talk about your new book. Why was it important for you to tackle the Trayvon Martin trial?
Well, I covered the case for NBC News, gavel to gavel, and as I did, I saw a case that I thought was going off the rails. This is very different than any other case I'd covered in the last 20 years, where I've been a legal analyst covering every high-profile trial in America.
How do you think it differed?
It seemed to me that the witnesses were not prepared and that the prosecution was going in one direction and the evidence was going in another direction. They simply weren't arguing their best evidence. So I'll give you one quick example.
Please.
George Zimmerman indicated that on a videotape that his gun was holstered behind him, inside his pants with a shirt and jacket over it. Yet he says he was on his back with Trayvon Martin on top of him. He says Trayvon saw the gun, reached for the gun, and threatened to kill him, and that's when he had to pull the gun and shoot in self-defense. Well, unless Trayvon Martin had X-ray vision, there is no way he saw through the bulk of George Zimmerman's body to a gun holstered behind him. But the prosecution, Lola, was not arguing that in the courtroom. I became very concerned. If they're not arguing that, what else are they not arguing in this case? So I did my own investigation after the case was over to find out what really happened. I had new interviews with all the important people in the case, and guess what? This case went off the rails even worse than I imagined. I think it was just a terrible injustice.
Were you surprised by the verdict?
No, I wasn't. I said on air it was going to be an acquittal. Why? Because both sides were arguing reasonable doubt. The prosecution did not give the jury a roadmap to conviction, which they do in any other case.
But what do you think went wrong? Why weren't they fighting harder, and why were they missing these important details?
Well, that's the key question, right? I call that the blow it or throw it question. Did they just blow the case, or did they intentionally throw the case?
Now, a lot of people think that they intentionally threw the case.
I know they do, and a lot of people who read my book come to that conclusion. So I leave that to my reader to decide. I will say that Angela Corey, the lead prosecutor, smiled into the cameras after she lost the case and said, "The system worked." Are you kidding me? Only one of the four prosecutors right after they lost said he was disappointed with the verdict. But ultimately, I think that they just didn't believe in the case from the very beginning. You know, I have a lot of interviews in the book of people who were involved. Some of them say they never thought that Trayvon Martin was the victim. And I think that ultimately racial profiling was at the heart of this case, even more so than most of us imagined. Not just for George Zimmerman, but for many of the participants in this case.
But a lot of people may ask, well, real quick, before we get to that, what did they have to gain by throwing the case? Why would they do that?
Well, and again, I'm not saying they are. Let people come to their own conclusion. But if they did, listen, the police did not arrest George Zimmerman for 45 days. And the police are vindicated by an acquittal. Angela Corey said afterwards, "We put all of the evidence out there and we let America decide. We did our job." Well, you know what? That's not their job. Their job is actually to connect the facts and the law and give the jury a roadmap to conviction. They didn't do that.
Why do you think that this case really captured the nation? I mean, even President Obama weighed in on this.
I think because it's the microcosm of so many problems that we have in our culture. Clearly, racial profiling was at the heart of the case. And how do we know that? Because George Zimmerman always told the story about what happened that night, beginning with burglaries that happened in the neighborhood 6 months prior. Those burglaries had nothing to do with Trayvon Martin. He was not a criminal, a burglar. He had no history of violence. Why was Trayvon Martin always compared to these burglars? Because the defense said it was a match. Well, what's the match? Skin color. That was the only match. The prosecution should have been on their feet objecting to that. To attribute the wrongs of two African Americans to all African Americans is the very definition of racism. But the prosecution never argued that in the courtroom. That was a big miss on their part.
Well, what else did this trial expose about race relations in America? Because it seemed like it just all boiled over.
Well, you know, the subtitle of my book is The Inside Story of the Trayvon Martin Injustice and Why We Continue to Repeat It. Because I don't just write about the Trayvon Martin case. This is also about Jordan Davis, about Darius Simmons, about Jonathan Farrell, about Renisha McBride. So many unarmed young African Americans in our culture shot and killed based on assumptions, suspicions. That's why I call the book Suspicion Nation. We have to get past our fears of our neighbors, our suspicions of one another, and let's get real, our suspicions of African American men, the fear that they are criminals. And President Obama, as you say, has even talked about that. I really wanted to drill down in the book to see whether that's even true, whether it's even fair to make that assumption. And the answer is it's not. Most crime in America is intra-racial, meaning black on black, white on white. If I'm burglarized, it's 6 times as likely to be by a white person than by a black person. And so these incredible fears we have, they're just misplaced as a matter of logic. One last example on that. George Zimmerman, when he got out of his car that night, he was more likely to be hit by lightning than to have Trayvon Martin attack him. That's the kind of thing I wish the jury could have heard about instead of all this talk about black crime in the neighborhood, which wasn't even based on the facts.
Wow. Well, since you mentioned so many other cases, what do you think it was about this case that made it dominate the headlines?
You know what it was? The family of Trayvon Martin wanted an arrest. For 45 days, they knew who shot and killed their son, who was unarmed, just coming home with candy and a fruit drink in his pocket. And Zimmerman wasn't arrested. Why not? And so a few days passed. They thought maybe the police need a little bit more time. It just didn't happen. And so they went to the media. And by the way, hats off to the black media in particular who seized upon this story, who grasped immediately the implications of this case, and who kept the case alive in the media. And a lot of others of all races joined in because we understood this was a case about racial profiling, about a story that happens too often in America. I believe this is like the modern day Emmett Till case, sadly.
Wow.
The young kid in 1955
Absolutely.
also killed coming back with candy in his pocket from a convenience store. The white shooter acquitted after a trial. I mean, I think this is an iconic case. I think it's an important case. And I thought, what can I do? Well, one thing I can do is expose the injustice that happened here. That's what I tried to do.
Speaking of injustice, a lot of people think these stand your ground laws and laws like stop and frisk are completely unjust. Where do you stand on these things?
Absolutely.
Do they have any merit at all?
I'm so glad you raised that. And I call the book Suspicion Nation because this is not just about Florida. It's about the entire nation. Here in New York City, for example, 4 million black and brown young men stopped and frisked over the last 10 years. There's a huge amount of litigation over that. And almost all of them were innocent of any crime. But it's so disconnecting when you see the police as the enemy, as just out to get you. In Los Angeles, where I live, it's also a continuing problem. So stop and frisk, I'm glad to say, is over in New York City thanks to the election of Bill de Blasio, who ran in large part on that platform. Stand your ground is present in about half the states in America, also a huge, huge problem, and I have a chapter about that in the book.
Well, do you think there's any chance that the stand your ground laws will ever be repealed?
If we the people decide we want them repealed, they will be. It's up to us. One of the things I'm trying to do in the book is raise consciousness about these issues. And Stand Your Ground has a huge racial disparity in terms of how it's administered. So a white person who kills a black person in a Stand Your Ground state, 354% more likely to be acquitted than when it's the other way around. So Stand Your Ground, there's a huge benefit to having white skin, not only on a Stand Your Ground case, but really throughout the criminal justice system. We got a long way to go before we get to racial equality in this country, and I think we all need to understand what's really going on. And in our criminal justice system, the one place where everybody should get equal treatment, right?
But Lisa, isn't this post-racial America? We have a black president, things are supposed to be getting better. This book basically is saying that, nah, not so much.
Well, in some areas, clearly we have improved. And there are some individuals who are extraordinary. President Obama, Oprah. I mean, you folks are fabulous,
well,
right?
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
But for the vast majority of African Americans, things really haven't changed that much since the civil rights era. So we talk about breaking the glass ceiling, and that's wonderful. But most people are still trapped on what's called the sticky floor, which is that black income relative to white income, about the same. And one of the saddest things that I talk about in the book is segregation in schools. We really have made very little progress on integrating schools. Most kids go to segregated schools where just their own race is present predominantly. And I think that's the biggest part of the problem, because when you don't interact with people of a different color, you become fearful. You become suspicious.
You fear what you don't know.
Exactly. And so we really have to get our kids to understand people of different backgrounds so that we can overcome this.
Now, your mother happens to be legendary civil rights lawyer and activist Gloria Allred. What was it like growing up with this woman as your mom?
So my mother...
Did she bake cookies? Did you have play dates? I mean...
And by the way, I dedicate the book to my mother in honor of her fearless relentless, lifelong fight against injustice. She's really been an inspiration to me. We didn't bake cookies. We talked about important issues. We talked about gender. We talked about sexual orientation. We talked about race. One of the things I learned in writing the book and speaking all over the country about it is how uncomfortable many people are talking about race.
It's true.
And I will tell you, this was news to me because we always talk about everything. And she's a civil rights lawyer, and I'm a practicing civil rights lawyer, so I've always been very comfortable. But, you know, it's like talking about religion or death. You know, it's one of those topics people aren't comfortable talking about. But my mom is just a tremendous inspiration to me every day. She's still out there stirring up trouble wherever she
sure
goes.
is, and that's why we like her.
Yes. Did she encourage you to become an attorney? Because you're a prominent attorney in your own
Encourage
right.
is a mild term for me.
Really?
It was basically, you're going to law school, and let me tell you, when Gloria Allred tells you to do something, it's better if you just do it right
You
away.
do it.
listen.
Yeah, that's the easiest thing to do. Yeah.
Was she strict?
No, I don't think she was strict. You know, I think she allowed me to kind of find my own way. I was a pretty good kid. I was a bookworm.
No.
So I always loved to read books. Now I'm writing a lot of books. But, you know, she let me kind of have the freedom. I also think back, look, I'm 52 years old. Back then, a lot of kids
You look
had
good.
more freedom.
Whoa.
Well, thank
Oh,
you. So do you.
Thank you.
But, you know, you're not my age, but thank you. You know, she let me have freedom. And I raised my kids the same way, actually. Kind of a non-worrier.
You're a non-worrier.
Yeah.
All right. Talk about Swagger, your book Swagger. Let me know about that.
Okay, so Swagger was my previous book, and it's about raising boys in America. My first book, Think, is about girls. And as I went all over the country talking about girls and problems with women and girls in this country, parents would say to me, what about boys? And I would say, well, what about boys? What is the problem with boys? And
What was the
I did
problem?
some research, and I was really shocked at what I found, that boys are so far behind girls in school. In all 50 states, for example, kids are tested at 3 levels for reading. Guess in how many of the 50 states boys are behind girls?
All of them.
All of them, all 50. In 40 developed countries, kids are tested for reading skills. Out of the 40 countries, how many are the girls exceeding the boys, do you think?
All of them.
All of them.
Why
That is
such
correct.
a separation? What's the
so
problem?
girls are outperforming boys at every level in just about every subject. They're graduating in greater numbers with better grades. The top 10% of the class crowded with girls, bottom 10% of the class crowded with boys. This is a problem because going into the job market in their 20s, girls are getting, or young women are getting better jobs, getting higher pay in cities across America. So hooray for the girls for doing well, right? That's great. But the flip side of it is that our boys are really having some problems. Boys are getting suspended and expelled at huge numbers. Very different when I was a kid. Things that used to get sent to the principal for, boys are now getting expelled for.
So what
It's
advice
really
do
a
you give
problem.
parents to get their boys back on track?
So that's the second half of my book, is how to raise up strong boys, and free or low-cost options of how to do that. A lot of it is old-fashioned stuff. Get them off the screens. Get them off of the devices and away from the TV. I have a lot of the brain research that shows how bad those screens are, especially for kids under the age of 10. They need to read real books. They need to have conversations with real people. Parents, talk about your values. The good news is that boys really do look up to their parents.
They need
just as
recess.
girls do.
You run off that testosterone.
Yes, get you, as we used to say, get your spielkas out. That's get us for you. Got to get all that out of your system, right? They need to. We can't cut recess and expect kids to like school, right? And cut art and drama, all the things that we used to like. That used to keep us in there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's tough times for our kids now.
Let's talk about your new gig. Today's Show?
Yes, today's
Okay.
show, legal analyst. Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
I was on this morning. Thank you. It's a lot of fun. I do it from LA a lot, which means I get up at 2:45 a.m. But, you know, what are you going to do?
2:45 a.m.
Because I have to be on at 4 a.m. in LA for it to be 7 a.m. in New York.
And you're in the first hour usually.
So I'm on usually at 7:30 where we cover the legal stories. So I've been talking about Oscar Pistorius.
Yes.
You know, really.
So what do you
big
think?
legal
Is he going to be
stories.
convicted or not?
I think he will be convicted of at least culpable homicide, because even if you believe his story that it was an accident, he thought it was a burglar when he shot through the door, you know, boy, how do you just go shooting through a locked bathroom door without checking to see who's in there, without even making sure that's not your girlfriend? Doesn't that sound like negligence to
Sounds
you?
like yeah. Do you believe his story?
I don't believe his story. I'll tell you why. There are 5 witnesses who say they heard her screaming before he shot. The bathroom door was locked and she was fully clothed. That doesn't sound like she went in there in the middle of the night just to use the bathroom. Would you lock the door if you're with your boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse in the middle of the night? Yeah, and she had a cell phone in there with her. So it sounds to me more like they were having a fight. She went in there, he probably angry, shut the door, locked the door, he's screaming. He also has a history of being reckless with guns, shooting one off in a car, another one in a restaurant. They just used a video today of him shooting a watermelon and making jokes about it being the zombie killer. So this is a guy who was very careless with guns, and I think what a tragedy that this young woman lost her life as a result.
It is. I'm glad you figured it all out for us, though. Now we know what's going to happen in the
Anything else
case.
you need, just ask.
I know.
Yes,
We'll definitely have you back. And
Thank you so much.
congratulations on your book, and we'll be watching it. Thank you so much.
Thank
and it's
you. I
available
appreciate it.
anywhere books are sold, so make sure you go out and get it.
And I love to hear from anybody on Twitter or Facebook, just at Lisa Bloom.
At Lisa Bloom. All right, we got it.
Thank you.
And you're watching Arise Entertainment 360.